Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Critical Adjunct. In this episode, I comment on Bret Weinstein's interview of Brittany King that was conducted in April of this year. I also talk about a little more in depth of some of the things that they discuss, like Robin DiAngelo's book, and make comments regarding that and her philosophies. If you haven't watched the interview, I think it's a good idea to do so because it's an open and honest conversation, a give and take, you might say, between the two of them, that I think we need to have more of in this country, especially in these times. And so, hello to Bret and Brittany. I hope you've had a chance to watch this, and if you have, I thank you for it. So I'd like to open by discussing Bret's comment about the black family picnic in the park, and his reluctance to walk through the park at the time. And I suspect, because I've had similar experiences myself, I suspect that Bret had a desire not to offend the family. But as I think about it, as I've given it a good bit of thought, and again, I've experienced the same thing. I wonder why we have a desire not to offend in those kinds of circumstances. I mean, Bret wasn't talking about disrupting the picnic. He was talking about walking through the park. And so I wonder, would Bret have felt the same way if a white family was having the picnic or an Hispanic family was having the picnic? I suspect that he wouldn't have felt that way. And so I think it's important for us to think about why we have the kinds of feelings and perhaps even fears that we have when it comes to race. And Brittany's comment about being reluctant to let go of her weapon is another experience that I also share. And I believe, like she, that it is exhausting to constantly having to be at the ready with our weapon. But my reluctance to drop my weapon doesn't have anything to do with my black counterpart. Rather, it is more for fear of what my people that look like me will do. And so I'm not ready to drop it because of them. And as Brittany suggests, it is an exhausting experience. And I think it's particularly exhausting for those of us in higher education today. Brittany refers to DiAngelo's book, and I find DiAngelo's conceptualization that racism is built into white people and they are incapable of changing it very troubling, and certainly not consistent with my experience. Additionally, I agree with what appears to be Brittany's rejection of DiAngelo's premise that racism is so baked into the white psyche and it's so deep that it can never be erased or removed. In my view, D'Angelo's generalization about white people are not supported by good research methods, nor are they consistent with my experience, as noted before. Does racial life in America have to be, quote, a roiling racial waters sea, close quote, as she describes it? Or can it be an open and honest conversation as Bret and Brittany's interview is? But in spite of my disagreement with many of D'Angelo's conclusions and the method through which she arrives at those conclusions, perhaps her book has something to offer in that she raises the issue about human bias. That recognition, I believe, is important because we must recognize our unconscious biases and address them head on to avoid slipping into or being accused of being systemically racist. And when we simply accuse all white people, as D'Angelo does, of, quote, holding social and institutional power over people of color, close quote, we ignore the advances that have been made since the end of Jim Crow. In a previous video, I discussed conversations between my black Air Force roommate and myself about racism and his experience with discrimination. Those conversations and what I was reading at the time served as a theme for a luncheon speech I was invited to give to a group of businessmen in Sacramento who were dedicated to supporting young Catholic men who wished to study for the priesthood, something I intended to do after my Air Force service was concluded. Consider that against D'Angelo's contention that white people are not comfortable discussing racism. Well, I'm sure that's true for some. I had no problem as a 19-year-old kid speaking about systemic racism to a group of white and Hispanic businessmen in 1963 when racial tensions were much deeper than they are today. Brittany's understanding that racism will always be baked into the American fabric is one that I think might historically be true, but hope the fabric has been washed cleaner as we approach the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, 57 years after the 1964 legislation. One might ask the question why Brittany's desire to be a bridge over the racial divide seems so novel today. Has the bridge that was built in the last half of the 20th century been torn down by current drama? I don't believe it has. I believe it still stands. But one suspects some would like to see it completely torn down. So in order to assuage Brittany's concern about the American fabric, and re-rinse it clean, we must, in my view, engage in a self-reflective process to examine how the historical fabric of racial bias in America has been woven into our unconscious inclinations. Bret talks about their age difference and that he has seen significant improvement, and that suggests that there is still a bridge, and perhaps the fabric is cleaner than it once was. To his point about age differences, I'm 25 years Bret's senior and nearly 60 years Brittany's. So the historical fabric of racism is perhaps woven deeper into me and members of my birth cohort. But I think it's fair to say that people like me have seen the difference and are confident that we are closer to achieving what everyone claims he or she wants. Bret alludes to what people say when Brittany leaves the room. While I believe that scenario has improved significantly since 1964, I would argue that it depends entirely on who is in the room, on what is being said. Perhaps Bret's experience of it has more to do with the people with whom he associates. I believe there are still situations where unkind things are said, and perhaps in a minority of cases, the words are more than simply unkind because of an either unconscious or a conscious bias toward others. And perhaps that is part of the fabric that needs to be washed a little cleaner. However, these are individual and not systemic examples of racism. And as Charles Murray writes in the final chapter of his book, Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America, quote, many of the problems in America are systemic, but they will not be solved by focusing on racism. They will be solved or ameliorated by going after systemic education, systemic law enforcement, systemic employment problems. Those problems are exacerbated by individual racism. The racism is not systemic, close quote. To that, I would add that much of what is experienced by the individual amounts to unconscious bias, and sadly for some, explicit racism. Bret and Brittany, I hope you have taken the time to watch this episode of The Critical Adjunct. Our main thesis regarding race is that we must recognize our unconscious, quote, inclinations of temperament or outlook, close quote, as Merriam-Webster defines bias, and address them head on in order to change the American fabric, even more than it was changed in the 20th century. Brett, I enjoy listening to you and Heather on the Dark Horse. It is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, podcasts, and I'm looking forward to reading The Hunter-Gatherer's Guide. And Brittany, I'm new to your work and look forward to following your podcast and writing more closely. Thanks to both of you for taking the time to watch or listen to this video. And thanks to everyone else. I hope that you will continue to access the critical adjunct. Our focus will not simply be on race, but it certainly is an important focus. Thanks everyone. If you enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up.